writer and researcher working in the field of film and performing arts, specializing in cinematic stagings of the body, feminist and queer theory, and contemporary short film cinema. Her master's thesis, Wars That Matter, Deconstructing Binary Conceptualizations of Sex, Gender, and the Body in 4 Alter Horror Shorts, was awarded the Student Award for Excellent Academic Achievement by the Department of English at the University of Vienna in 2024. Congrats. Since 2019, she has contributed as a film and art writer to several publications, including Talking Shorts, Le Nouveau Riche, and Courtfilm.be. In 2025, she served as a jury member of the German competition at Kurzfilm Festival in Hamburg. She currently works in a dramaturgy at Vienna's Theater in Bad Josefstadt, and is beginning her doctoral studies on incoherent bodies in post-human cinema. Welcome.
Okay, it's really amazing that so many people are here. Yesterday I arrived and I asked Ellie if anybody's going to come, so I think that question was kind of, not necessary. Thank you for coming. I'm really, really excited to talk basically about my master's thesis, but also updating it, because my master's thesis, the short films that I wrote about, they were only directed by men. So Ellie asked me if I would be open to have to talk, but have new films. So I don't know if anyone was in the body horror program earlier. Was anybody? Yeah, okay. So one film you're gonna know because it's from this program, and then one I took from last year's program. And on a very broad level, this is a talk about aesthetics, about film specificity, about the medium of film. That being said, I don't have PowerPoint right now, and I don't have InDesign right now, so I made this presentation with Word. So this is not going to be aesthetic at all. I'm sorry. I have a few more questions before we start. I'm going to talk about 10 different things. So my first question, did anybody do like lectures on horror film before, or feminist horror film before? Okay. And how many people have you watched loads of horror films? Yeah, that's good. I'm going to talk about some feminist horror film theory, I'm going to talk about gender theory, and I'm going to talk about short film. And I'm going to rush through this like theoretical mess. Because what I'm doing is a bit like heady, maybe too sophisticated, not sophisticated, maybe it's a bit too intellectual sometimes, so I think you'll need to understand where I'm coming from in terms of my nerdiness in gender theory. So, basically, it's not going to be news if I tell you that horror films are kind of ambivalent when it comes to representation of women. We have women as victims, women as monsters. We have Barbara Creed talking about the feminine and the monstrous. We have Carol Clover who talks about the final girl, and the final girl, of course, lends her name to this festival. Maybe I'm going to talk about the final girl a little bit, but not too much. These ambivalent representations of women in horror film are what I would say leads to the massive richness of scholarship in horror films, because everything that kind of creates friction is super susceptible to being studied a lot. And this is why I think this ambivalence and these frictions create so much space to talk about horror films, because it's not the usual great high cultural product, but it's like very lowbrow, it's popular cinema, and that's what I'm really interested in and have been interested for a long time. When we talk about representation, we often arrive at questions like, is this good representation or is this bad representation? Like, is this good representation of women? Is it sexist? Is it empowered? And the question I was asking myself is this a question that we should always ask first? Is it always about the narrative and the context first, or should we also just consider on a more meta level maybe the structures of the images and how the images work? And that's what I will be doing, and what we will be doing, and what you will see on this beautiful word presentation that I made. Thank you for laughing. Could also just stand up, maybe. Okay. So what I found really interesting with the final girl concept that Carol Clover introduced is that she studies the final girl in 80s slasher films, which are, I think we can all agree, they're not very good when it comes to how women are represented. Those who don't know, the final girl is the girl who lives in these slasher films. And usually she lives because she doesn't have sex and because she's probably Christian. So these are really complicated structures because women who have sex are punished and killed off. Black people are punished and killed off. So this is the problem that exists in slasher films. And what Carol Clover did was she looked at this final girl, actually a really problematic figure, and she said, well, if this is the girl who survives all these stages of these horror films, then there has to be some sort of weird spectator identification going on, because if loads of men watch horror films, which back then we said only men watch horror films, then they have to kind of identify with this girl. And that's kind of where this also starts. It's this idea of that there's something in a narrative or in a representation that maybe, if we look at it really closely, goes against the very, very big questions of representation. Because I really spent so much time reading about horror film, you're going to have to hear about horror film. The monstrous feminine is another example of this tendency to study representation in horror film. And what Barbara Creed did, which maybe you know, maybe you don't, I'm sorry if I'm boring you, is that she studied how women as monsters in horror film are usually represented as monstrous because they have feminine monstrosity traits. So it's reproduction, it's pregnancy, it's menstruation that are monstrous in these films. And when I read Creed's works, what I found really intriguing is that she has these amazing analyses of these processes. It's ingenuous to even think about that, to have such insights that you come up with this term. Nothing I'm saying here should ever go against anything these women did. But she never really talks about how these monsters are represented. It's always about what their function is and what this symbolizes, and it's really usually not about, I don't know, is it a close-up that's framing her? What lighting is used? What is the pacing and the mood of these shots? And this is also what she does with her updated version of the monstrous feminine, where she talks about feminist new wave cinema. And here she also talks about how cannibalism is subversive in these films. But she doesn't talk about why it looks as it does. And this is the last thing that's very general, but that I really wanted to share, is this concept of elevated horror. And I'm sure you've seen elevated horror films that are like art house, indie, drama inspired. And I think that's a really interesting spot as well, going then into body horror, because this kind of elevated horror is really a genius kind of construction, because it takes elements from drama and from popular media that is not considered shit, basically, I'm sorry. And it turns it into a kind of hybrid structure that appeals also to the more indie art house audience. And I think what I'm interested in is how can we study maybe films that do not aim primarily at being pretty or aesthetic, and how can we look at these films with the same kind of respect and closeness. Horror film is super alive, there's letterbox lists. Always at the top of my letterbox is horror films that you must have seen, IMDb. We have so many new horror films coming up, which is frankly amazing. Especially with body horror, I think it's super interesting that we're coming back to these ideas of disgust in our bodies and shame in how they behave. And that's really also the difference to the studies that Creed and Clover did, because what they did was study antagonists, basically. Antagonists or heroes. And in body horror we don't usually have antagonists, it's just the body itself that kind of becomes fearsome and loathsome as well. Another thing that interested me about short film is that nobody really ever talks about it. And it's really hard to talk about short film because it's so hard to grasp. It's so hard to talk to anyone about a short film you've seen because probably they won't have seen it. Even if they've seen a lot, when you're at the third short film that you want to discuss, it's like, it's over. There's no possibility of having these shared experiences. So this is also an attempt to kind of create discourse about something that's not talked about a lot usually. I'm a doctoral student, freshly, which is super cool. Right now I'm working in a theater where we're doing lots of really conservative productions. So it's kind of a diverse spot that I'm at right now. But I'm super happy to come back to my master's thesis, which has been almost 2 years that I completed it. And the topic was the same as this talk, the deconstruction of sex, gender, and the body in short film. And the guiding questions, as you can see above, were how are bodily mutilation, transformation, and invasion represented with film-specific means, and how are filmic techniques like close-ups, lighting, sound, editing, mise-en-scène used to construct these processes, and why this matters. For me, looking at bodies is always connected to gender, especially if we look at bodies that change and that are changing, because if bodies are usually still considered the basis of gender, like our biology is supposed to determine our gender, that's how it's supposed to be. So looking at how bodies change, I argue, is always inevitably connected to how these gender conceptualizations change. Why short film? I talked about that already, I skipped that. I'm talking too much anyways. On the basis of format, the short film is very interesting because it's so condensed, obviously. Like a short story, you have usually only a single idea. You have no real plot or character development, so it's one idea that is explored, and that is the central idea, and that makes it so interesting for me to study body horror, because you don't have all these other stories coming in and influencing the analysis. It's really usually just this idea, what is going to happen to the body, and that is explored. And I'm so excited too, because I'm going to take something away, but I was really scared that I'm not going to be able to say anything because my master's thesis was like so closed in itself, and I had this great conclusion to my master's thesis, and I was like, what if it doesn't apply? But it does apply, so it's going to be amazing. Who knows the definition of body horror? There's not a test. I'm asking because sometimes we consider body horror 10 different things. Here I'm going to consider body horror not the feeling of watching something horrific or terrifying or disgusting, but really just what's happening on screen. So I've seen definitions or people talking about body horror, and what they're really talking about are like really gory, violent, torture slasher films. That's not what I'm interested in. I'm really just interested in this idea that Philip Brophy coined, that body horror is about fears of the own body and its functions and malfunctions. So the films I looked at for my thesis, they focused on bodily decay, on disintegration, damage, transformations, with the core theme of the loss of bodily control in a way, and something unexpected happens to the body. And this supposedly stable, whole entity that our bodies are supposed to be, if we believe the humanist conception of the body, then this really just falls apart and kind of destroys the basis of our identities as well. And the last point on here is really just what I said before, is that if we believe that the body provides some sort of source for any identity that we have, then if the body changes, then something has to change. This is my very broad attempt to kind of grasp how the body was conceptualized in philosophy, from the ancient philosophers to also probably still today, is that we have this really popular idea of the mind and body dualism. So this is the belief that we are a body, and in that body we put a mind, and that's also the idea we see now when we talk about mind uploading, is the idea that we can just take a mind and put it somewhere else, and it doesn't make any difference where this mind is located. It's a body, it's an interface, doesn't matter. And what happens when we have two poles is usually that one is better and one is worse. With body and mind is better and the body is worse. And this sets off a chain of events where these dualisms or binaries are always connected and keep going into the next thing. So what happens next is that women become somehow associated with the body much more, and men become associated with the mind. This means, in the end, that men are rational and women are irrational, emotional, soft, changeable. And there's a really nice quote by Elisabeth Gross, she's a feminist theorist. She said that through this process women became to be thought of as somehow more biological and more natural than men. This is also what we see when we connect like the feminine energy to the earth, to nature. This is not always a bad process and it can be used in a good way, but this is the source of these thoughts. The problem is, if we believe women are more emotional and less rational than men, then they are also somehow maybe less able to achieve rationality than men, and this is the basis of a lot of stereotypes and oppression. What I find really interesting about how I think about binary sex today is that it's really not a concept that was always just there. It was in the Middle Ages that they had a one-sex model, where it was just one human being and one is the man, and that's the ideal, and then there's the same sex but worse, and that's women. It was only in the 17th century that medical advances kind of allowed a study of bodies that enabled a categorization of binary sex. And binary sex is an illusion because we have so much variation. It honestly doesn't make a lot of sense to keep up this binary. But since it's such a strong foundation of how we think about men and women, this binary is not only a norm, but it's normative. And it's limiting the way bodies can exist in society. So we know this from intersex activism, that if you're born intersex, your body is changed, and your body is operated without consent. And these operations are an effect of the norm, but they also recreate the norm. So by having these operations, binarity is enforced in effect. So this ideology becomes stronger and stronger because the more we interfere in this natural diversity, the more it becomes naturalized, and seems like it's just always been that way. Binary is the norm and it's the only thing that really works. And third wave feminists especially try to break up this idea that sex is the stable biological basis on which gender is based. So there's a lot of ideas about the construction of this idea of binarity, and I think this example of intersex activism is the best way to kind of visualize or think of how these norms work and how these norms materialize things and materialize things. So my central claim and the method for my analysis is that we have to look at how bodies change in order to grasp how sex and gender change. I've said this a lot, but it's important. And the way that I'm going to do this is in complicated academic terms. I stole or took this from a scholar, she's called Sarah Dillon, and she proposes a method of reading that's called metonymic reading. And a metonym is when you take a small part of something and apply it to a whole. And what I'm going to do is we're going to take stills from these two short films, and we're going to analyze how the bodies work there. And I'm going to argue that these images can stand for the whole of these films. And we're going to look at what is shown and how it is shown in the very, very most basic terms. Which brings me finally to the two films. The first is called Nosocomophilia, which is a name that describes, it's actually a phobia typically nosocomophobia is the fear of hospitals, and here it's turned around. It's like this attraction to being at the hospital. And the second film is Breeders, and I think that one was in the program today. So, we're going to start with nosocomophilia. The story is about a woman who becomes obsessed with going to the hospital. And it starts with her in her home, and her housekeeper, who's incidentally a person of color, starts shaking and faints. And Frances, the protagonist, she's white, middle-aged, upper class, I would say. She takes her to the hospital, and there it kind of overwhelms her. She gets this overwhelming urge to get examined, and that's what the film is doing. She's getting examined. And this slide has no images, but we're going to look at many images in a second. We're going to see that in the depictions of her body in this film, there is no unity or wholeness. She's fragmented, she's distorted, there's a lot of mirrors used. And if we just take these images, we're going to see that this is not a body that is stable or that we can put any meaning in, but that's multiple and fragmented and disjointed. So these are the images I took. It was not hard finding them in the film, I have to say. They appear all the time, so we have loads of superimposition, we have these mirrors. On the top here, we see the receptionist of the hospital, on the top right. And on the right is just the body, or like the torso of Frances in the mirror. It's a reflection of her décolleté, which I think is like just super interesting, because this is the whole interaction between them. We don't see Frances herself, but we just hear her voice disembodied, her torso talking to this woman. And on the bottom here we have the same thing. It's like a really 10-second shot of her with just this light flare that's breaking up her face and intruding kind of in the composition of this close-up, actually. And the top left is also a superimposition. And here it's kind of, it's not as visible here, but it's actually a medical drawing of a thyroid or of a part of the throat that's superimposed on her face. So this is also, in a way, if we want to read it like that, which I hope you're going to follow me in this, is that it's an externalization of an organ and then it's superimposed. So I think visually it's just amazing how much there is like going on. And on the bottom right, this is kind of her mirror setup, and we have this shot multiple times throughout the film. And her physical state, as we can see, deteriorates. So she has here this kind of blindfold because her eye is swelling, and that's super interesting in this film, because she gets examined and examined and examined, and nobody ever talks about her eye, and it's not ever made, like they don't believe her, they just tell her it's normal like that. I will return to my very close analysis in a second, but when we are this close, it's also really important to just say that in all of these films I watched as preparation for this talk, the women are framed in this body horror in the medical system and not understood. So this is, I think we can say, the overarching theme of these shorts, like 8 of them, is women trying to see a doctor and them not believing in them. So I don't want to ever sweep that under the rugs. That's very present in the film as well, and these topics are very interesting as well. It's just not what I'm doing. Okay, so this shot that I put here is kind of a continuation of the one you saw before. It's like this red interfering in the image. And here is the red and her face doubled. And these are used as kind of intrusive cuts into the narrative of the film that again act as an externalization of internal processes. In that case, she keeps getting more and more aroused by this examination that she's getting. And here the red is obviously also symbolizing this kind of passion that she feels. And I would argue that, again, if you really look closely at this image, it's again just a dissolving of boundaries, of inside and outside, and of the body and its outlines. Because in all of these shots, we don't have the outline of a body, it's always more than one. This keeps getting worse. Her body literally starts to dissolving next, so her skin is peeling. And that's what also this image on the left shows here. And I found it really interesting that you have this kind of dissolving on a literal level with this shot here. And then on the right, this is the last shot in the short. And what's happening is she's having a final examination. All the doctors are lined up in the examination room, which is already brightly lit. And it's the last shot, and she's kind of crying. We don't really know why she's crying, because she had been aroused and happy before. So this is kind of ambivalent. But what then happens, it gets more and more overexposed until the image is completely white. So I would really like to propose a reading of this, of the body finally dissolving just into light, into nothing, into white. And white is also what I want to talk about next, because there's a really interesting intersectional axis in this film, obviously, because we have this housekeeper who's a person of color. And she's not examined, or we don't see her being examined, but instead she just keeps waiting in the waiting area. And she clearly has a very serious issue as well, but she's just also not present in the film, in the narrative. So there arises this kind of two poles again. So we have Frances, the white protagonist, who is really mobile within the hospital, and she's pushed from doctor to doctor to doctor. Not that they're finding anything, even though they should, but at least they're looking at her, which is also a question of money in the film, so they're getting paid a lot for these examinations. Effectively, her body is not cured or healed or seen even, but it's just examined and dissected and fragmented visually, and by the doctors as well, who do the examination, look at her body parts. Couldn't put everything on here, but you should look at it. And then on the other hand, there's Lily, the housekeeper, the woman of color, and the who's just immobilized in the waiting room. She just stays there, and I'm going to show a few pictures of that in a second. And I would say that we have here just a really like a binary relation of the two women, between treatment and visibility, but also between a body that is treatable, and that is the white body, and a body that is exposable, and that is the colored body. And that's, I would really read that dualism as the film taking apart the category of woman itself. So it kind of takes apart the notion that we can even talk about gender in this way, because it's not a universal category. Women are not the same. And that really happens in this film. We can see that very clearly. And the most interesting part is, if you want to go even deeper into this heady, oh, she's overanalyzing, in the hospital geography and in the architecture of the hospital, because it's going to be, it's really fragmented. We have a waiting room that looks nothing like the examination room. It's dark. It looks like it's probably filmed a different kind of day. It's lit completely different. And that is what we see here. So the pictures on the top are the examination room, which to me they kind of remind me of these, I don't know, like Midwestern sheriff's departments. This is what it looks like to me. And then we have on the bottom, just brightly lit room, big window, big light. And the one on the left, this is what she is in the beginning. And then the one on the right, this is her final examination, which is also very bright, and we again have the light, but here it's artificial light, and this artificial light is going to be what's taking over everything in the end of the film. Okay, next film. Readers has a very different mood. It's I would describe it, and maybe those of you who have seen it will agree or won't agree. You can disagree with me, it's fine. It's kind of structured around a kind of revenge narrative and kind of a gender biology reversal. So what happens is that beautiful women that turn out to be aliens pretend to be really drunk at a bar, look which men are shit enough to try to take advantage of them, and then implant them elegantly with alien babies. Different mood. I'm so happy to talk about this. Because the concept of a gender reversal is very obvious. Like, it's a very obvious thing to do, which doesn't mean it's bad, but which makes it even more interesting to look a bit more closely at what happens beneath this already very political statement that the film is making. So visually, there's a lot of distortion and some central scenes going on. This is on the image here is it's kind of a memory, which might be why they chose to distort the image in that way. But this is when the protagonist kind of wakes up and he realizes, oh no, there's probably a really bad thing going on. And we don't see the process of this alien rape, but we see this body just already very grotesque before anything has happened. It's already grotesque and strange and estranging. And the way this is shown in the whole film is that there's really quick cuts, montage, lights are flickering in his bathroom when he remembers this. And it's really hard to see here because she's not on there, but the woman who's actually doing this whole impregnation to him is actually distorted by the lens as well, because it's a really, I don't know if it's a fisheye lens, I'm not that good with like camera specifics, but she's kind of also distorted. So this is just a very surreal scene that kind of takes away any kind of natural body feeling, which is really strengthened by this use of the green light, which is all throughout the film. Yeah, like this ugly, disgusting green light. Interesting in this scene is also that his scream, as he screams, is doubled if you listen to the audio track. So it's really, it's not even one body anymore that's emitting this sound. This is another scene from this part that I'm describing, and there are like obviously very beautiful tentacles coming at him, fixating him. And all of this is just in this kind of stretched image. He then starts to develop very, very quickly lots of hunger, weird appetite, and a belly. So pretty clearly we are dealing with a take on pregnancy here. So it's not like, I've seen another film where the same scenario is used, but the male pregnancy is happening on the neck. Here it's very clearly, it's the stomach. It's supposed to remind us of pregnancies of people that have a uterus. Again, here you can see this green light, which is everywhere. And then we hear a stomach growling, and it's probably louder than anything that he has said during this whole sequence, which just kind of, again, kind of alienates us from this idea of a natural body. The birth sequence. This is not a pretty slide, it's too much on there, I know. This is mainly this birth sequence that's happening. He's in a lot of pain. The nurse is telling he's doing so good, he should push, he's bringing a life into the world. He's doing a beautiful thing and he's dying. The soundtrack is very nice. The soundtrack is mysterious, it's soft. On a narrative level, we are easily convinced, okay, this is a political statement. Women are again not being taken seriously, women's pain is not being taken seriously, and he's paying for it. He's paying for trying to rape a woman, and he's paying for never knowing what he's doing to women. So we have the discourse of maternal self-sacrifice mirrored on him, onto his male body. And now I'm going to take us back to what I said before about the male body as being rational and hard and basically impenetrable. Here this is not the case. He was penetrated, it's opening, it's going to come out. So this is in itself, it's already deconstructing this notion that men are kind of closed off to their environments more than women. Also, reproduction is suddenly not a thing anymore that is happening only to a uterus, but it's just happening in a body, and it doesn't matter what kind of body that is, it's just happening. And I would say that through this, we just get an idea of invasion and penetration as just being a core feature of any body and not of women's bodies in particular. What I find really interesting is that in this context, how it's framed is not that this pregnancy happens despite him being a man, but very much because he is a toxic, masculine, violent man. So this again kind of breaks up this notion that, oh, okay, it's not supposed to happen because he's a man. No, it's precisely why it happens, because he did all these things, which I think is just a really great idea to kind of play this out, looking at this very detailed layer. And now, I'm sorry, this is how it looks. So we have these really, not disgusting, we have these scenes of contorted bodies, and then again, I just wanted to put that in there because I think it's just a recurring visual strategy, is this idea of the superimposition, because you can see it as good here, but here are the faces of the women, the nurses, who are telling him he's doing so good, and they're smiling, and he's screaming, and it's all squished into one frame. And here on the top, the shot traces from his stomach down. I didn't want to put that on the slide, but you see his genitalia, and they're just, it doesn't look good. And you see it a little bit here. I didn't want to show you again, for those who've seen it before. And yeah, these are the alien babies that are going to grow into the beautiful tentacles that we've already seen as well. And now to my favorite part, which I do have time for, my master's thesis. I concluded in my master's thesis that there is not only a deconstruction going on in body horror, but there's also a reiteration of the very, very, very core concepts of femininity and masculinity that we can trace in the way the narratives are framed and are played out and structured. In the context of these two films, this kind of was the same. So I want to compare the two protagonists and what happens to them. So Francis and Richard was his name. Francis, she has an inexplicable condition that nobody is really either seeing or detecting or curing. It's as if it's not there. And it's also not clear in the narrative why it happens. With Richard, we have a very clear narrative indebtment. We know precisely why his body is changing. And we know that it's the change introduced from the outside. So it's not something that is within him, but it's invading his body from the outside and then changing his body from within. Now, this was the same experience that I had watching films from a master's thesis, where I had, I think it was like 10 or 12 body horror shorts, and all the transformations were played out on people that presented as women, and all the invasions were played out on protagonists that were read as men. So this got me thinking, okay, what does this mean? And I argue that there's a difference between spontaneous change and invasion narrative. And this is a gendered divide that's going on. So patterning this on a bigger picture and relating it also to what I was talking about in the beginning, unfortunately, I would argue that still, even though body horror deconstructs all bodies and takes them apart and takes them together in different ways again, there's still some things going on that need our attention. Women's bodies seem to be still within these films inherently predisposed to metamorphosis. They seem to be naturally changing, and there doesn't seem to be any reason for that. While men's bodies become vulnerable to only as an exception and from the outside. So, let's see here. Relating this to an even bigger picture, these films do a very interesting move. Readers, as I said before, there is no doubt about why this body is changing, and all the other transformations that are played out in women's bodies, we don't know. We just don't know why they are changing, and they get rashes, and their bodies are transforming, and there's just no causality in these films, and it's really super interesting that this happens, because masculinity and men's changes are then rationalized. We know why it's happening, and we can kind of get some closure. And with women, there's no causality and there's no rationality. So that was my findings for a master's thesis and for these two as well. So this is my conclusion. While body horror does serve as a deconstructive element on the level of individual films and aesthetics, examining its representational logic beyond the individual films exposes a prevalent and persistent underlying hegemonic assumption regarding femininity and masculinity within the narrative framework of the examined films. Thank you. Does anybody really want to say something? Does anybody really disagree? Is it annoying? Was it interesting? Because I thought it was annoying what I'm talking about. Because you get in your head so much, and you watch films and you make like really big, sweeping claims. And I wasn't sure if this actually, if you think this does the films justice, is it taking it apart too much? Yeah. No speechless. Yes?
What would you think, how the substance goes with your conclusion? Because I would say maybe there is a causality and also a definite cause that comes from the outside.
I don't want to suggest that this is always the case. It's definitely not always the case. This is a tendency. And that being said, I haven't seen the substance. I've seen the trailer, and I was like, I'm just not interested. It just didn't do anything. Maybe it would have done something for me, but from the trailer, I just wasn't interested. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Just curious, because I'm not like a big body horror fan, but then I'm also into more cyberpunk films, which use and incorporate body as a way of hijacking, mechanicalizing, and or either re-empowering, or things go horribly wrong through the modification of the body. And what I want to ask you in this case is that with body horror, as you framed or outlined it here, is it like an outsider, an internalized force that goes wrong, that causes the deconstruction or the downward demise of the protagonist. And what I want to ask you is, how can the narrative within either body horror or films that deal with like cyberpunk that have modifications to the body, can we reappropriate the idea of the body as a deconstructing and downfall of the narrative to actually have a different meaning towards the modifications altering and uplifting either the protagonist, but in a way that still ultimately shows the fragmentation of the body.
I'm not sure if I got your question right.
Maybe I'll make it more simpler. So, ultimately, like right now, we have the narratives are the gender constructions are around the bodies and how, basically, as you've outlined it, with both the films you've portrayed, both the narratives of protagonists are going down, and then one is about the internalizing of the feminine, and then one is the invasion with the masculine. When there are other films outside of body horror, such as cyberpunk, they choose to add like chips, like the movie Existence. They impose a chip to then empower themselves to then try to change and alter. My question to you is, can body horror serve to actually deconstruct not only the body and also not only of gender, but then in an empowerment of the protagonist, not just the downfall of the protagonist? Does the horror film always have to have this kind of ending, you know?
Yeah. That's a really good question. I think as soon as really technologies come into play, you're opening kind of a whole different discourse, because technology is always charged with so much emotion. I'm thinking if this is something to do just with the narrative structure of the horror film, that we always have to see something going down. But with not like clear horror films, I would say of course there's actually one example that I can give you from a short film, but it's not technology, but it is a horror film, and it's actually kind of similar to these kind of skin condition films. And there's a short film, and it's called Wretch. And it's just the transformation of a woman, and she's just pulling off her skin and screaming, and she's in a lot of pain, and then the film just ends. And her friend, who's also there, she asks her, how do you feel? And she's like, oh yeah, better. So I think there's definitely space to kind of break this up. I think with technology, you have this kind of dualism between pessimism and optimism really quickly, like transhumanism. We will exceed our bodies, and on the other hand, this idea of the Terminator. I don't know.
I guess just thinking of other horror films to relate this to that are not body horror. Like if we look at Midsummer, for example, where the main character is a protagonist, but is also technically the villain, with the referencing to the other gods and her being the May Queen, and then another horror film where she's not necessarily the villain, is Alien, where she doesn't necessarily get directly the body horror that's happening to the rest of the cast, but then her being smart-witted, she ends up winning and being the protagonist. So those have a different, those are adjacent, of course, to body horror, but not necessarily have the encapsulation of that. So I'm curious if there are examples of body horror that have those types of narratives where, or reinforcing the character as a gender protagonist, within the empowering the feminine. For example, Midsummer is empowering the feminine, of course, and same with Alien too. So I'm curious, that's what,
I can't answer you off the bat. I'm sure there are.
I was just wondering, if just thinking about tendencies, and like you said, body horror is sort of coming back a bit the last couple of years. Is it mostly newer films you have been watching, or did you also watch a bigger scope?
Yeah, so these two are from the last 2 years, and for my master's thesis I took, there's a YouTube channel, it's called Alter, and they publish loads of horror films in different playlists. And the ones I used for my master's thesis were all within a playlist that was called Body Horror. And I started in 2021. I started including films from 2021. So they were recent-ish, Yes? I was wondering if you find that the mechanics that you found about body horror as it relates to the binary changes once you introduce race into it. I think about two examples, and this is from Black perspectives, of Lovecraft Country, where there's a character who is a dark-skinned Black woman who is given some power to physically transform into a white woman in order to achieve access. And this is a very, very painful process of this change, but she makes a choice to physically do this to achieve. And then I think of a horror comedy called I'm Gonna Get You Sucker.
Yeah, I don't know.
It's hilarious. From the 90s. It's a Wayne's brothers film.
Okay.
And there's a moment of body horror of a woman who has a STI. And in order to get a man to leave her alone, she transforms like into a demon. So I wonder, you know, like this external idea, and these are movies, like they're decades apart, but when I've seen body horror, it within and I also think about the film that you mentioned here that starts with an N. Like the body horror there was this person being completely erased, like their story not being told and their body sort of invisibilized.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you find, because you've done a lot of research, if you found that once you introduce marginalized races into it, that the mechanics of body horror starts to shift and change.
Yes, but with like this kind of bracketing that the most of the films just completely bracket out race, completely. And this is something I've been actually thinking about for my doctoral project, because I'm using like speculative cinema as a broader term. So it's spanning kind of science fiction, body horror, hybrids as well. And the problem just is, it's just whiteness, it's just white. And I mean, this is interesting as well, because we have the question of on which bodies can we actually play out these fantasies of, in the case of my doctoral thesis, technological intervention. So I would say yes to your question, it changes immediately if we introduce race. Also in the case of these films, if we introduce whiteness, it's going to change, and it's actually what would be really interesting to look at these films in terms of also like critical whiteness, because it's hard to introduce race with like racism and people of color into films that are not there, but it's very interesting that they are not there. They're just not really present most of the time. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. I'm curious about a word that you used in talking about readers and the man's being invaded, impregnated. You used the word elegant. And this is just how I read it, but feel free to expound. But I'm curious if you think that there tends to be when we see depictions of men, those reversals of men being invaded, if there's typically more of a sense of compassion or sympathy when there is that role reversal, particularly when those who are born with a womb are often portrayed as being, it's natural that they know pain, they know discomfort through the leaving of birth.
Yeah, I think that's an issue that I have with these reversals in general, because it kind of plays on the idea that we can only understand the pain of one group by displacing it onto another group that we kind of care more about. So yes, I think there's, if you want to be really political, there's kind of an issue in reversing it like that.
I was thinking a lot during your presentation about some of the overlaps with possession movies with a lot of these themes, especially ones like Rosemary's Baby, The Exorcist, Jennifer's Body. And I was wondering if you, in your opinion, if you feel that possession movies are a form of body horror just because of the overlap.
I would say
in the definition that I set for myself, because there's many definitions, it would depend on how the possession is portrayed. Because in Rosemary's Baby, this is like a very psychological process, and it's not so. The fear of the body is there, but for me, what I was interested in is really the explicitness of the images. But of course, what's happening there is body horror. It's just not really visually present. Yes, is
Sorry,
there? Yeah, I see you.
I was wondering now, like with all the discussion, have you noticed with all the movies and shorts that you watch, your overall observation having like quote unquote exceptions when like different directors come into play, like woman, man, non-binary person from Europe, from America? Like, have you noticed any big differences on this, or it's just like an overall pretty much always?
It's definitely not overall general universal. There are exceptions to everything. Here the issue with like maybe also the selection for a master's thesis was also that I did English and American studies, so my focus was Anglophone film, so this kind of introduces a bias already. But this is why preparing this talk was so interesting, because writing my thesis, I ended up with these 4 films, and they were all directed by men. I was like, yeah, of course, this kind of course, it's stereotypical. So this was really interesting, because it's clearly not just, it's not an issue of being educated or not informed enough or not like politically correct enough. And that's also what I want to say about these films. They're doing great things, and they're super interesting, and they don't do anything wrong. It's just, I think, what is exposed when we look so closely is that we arrive just at the core binaries that structure so many things. But there were exceptions, but they were very, very few. Yeah.
First of all, I love when you go heady and thanks, so don't apologize for it, I relate. And I want to go a little bit deeper in the analysis and methodology. Because, do you ever talk to the directors or like other viewers? And I remembered I wanted to ask that when there was a little tension about what is elegant, for example, or is it a subjective method in analyzing? Yeah.
Elegant was me being ironic.
Okay.
But no, I didn't. I never ask directors what they think. I think it can be very interesting, but I think for what I do, it doesn't matter so much. What I would be really interested in is what other people think about these images, and like asking many people, because making these interpretations are like studies is just me saying this and me looking at this, and that's like saying, oh, this film causes me to feel this affect, and it's like, it's just me, like I can't I can't generalize. There is a chance that I'm just seeing what I've been seeing in these films. I hope it's not just that. Yes?
On that note, like, are you aware of like any discourse, like feminist discourse in that direction within, like, I don't know, like, I mean, I guess like us being here is probably like a good example, but like just generally, like, are you aware of any other people that are like doing research or like discourse on this specific? For example, I was irritated to like see like the distinction that you make also today in the shorts, that like all the skin rash horror was like basically like women's bodies, and like I've yet to see a horror film that like is, I mean, I'm not like the biggest horror nerd, but like I have yet to see a skin rash horror, for example, that has like a similar body happening to them basically.
Okay, first part of the question, am I aware of feminist discourse? Do you mean theory or like activism or like responses to
I guess
films?
both, like just like generally like an awareness for it.
I would hope so. With body horror studies in particular, there is a strong focus on how does it work that we feel disgust in our own bodies when we look at that. So the scholarship often does focus on that. And these studies of representation are very much feminist concerns, so yes. The second part of the question with the skin rash horror, you were irritated by that.
Yeah. I was surprised basically, like even within like a feminist context, that like all the like basically stuff that's related to like also like beauty standards, like which I, in my assumption, is like the skin rash condition stuff, kind of like playing into that. This is still like within this context, like so much connected to.
I thought about that because it's also in this program and last year there's like all the body horror shorts in these programs were skin related. I don't know if that's a selection, if that's just a programming choice. I think what these want to say and what these do, looking at like having like 5 of them, is that it's an externalization of an experience that women typically have of not being taken seriously in medical contexts. So I think that is just also an experience that is kind of put into a narrative. And it's very easy for us to see the hypocrisy of these medical contexts when it's on the skin, because we can see it. I think last year there was, or maybe also this year, the one where she's growing mushrooms everywhere.
Last year.
Yeah, and it's like, it makes you mad because it's like, clearly there is an issue. And I think that's the playfulness in there. And I think if it were an experience men had more, then probably there would be more of these films. I think.
Yeah.
Sorry, there was one more.
But there was more.
There were so many. Okay. Who else did I not see? I saw you did see it.
Yeah. I wanted to come back to your first question. Sorry for mentioning the substance again, but I had a similar thought, maybe because it was the horror film I watched before this program, so it's still in my mind. And then I thought also of a horror film I didn't find so good, but the same topic, the Ugly Stepsister, and they have both this idea of achieving beauty from a female position of not being beauty or being old, and that is a lot about external effects and doing treatments, and it doesn't end good for both of them. So I was thinking maybe this is just another, a different category of body horror in a way than the one you analyze, because. But then I was wondering still, it must have this underlying hegemonic assumptions also, because I think if you repeatedly see the same tropes, there must be something to it, right? So obviously the beauty thing, the societal pressure is a thing, but it would be interesting to analyze those also, like what is really beneath in terms of gender assumptions.
I think these dynamics, they're also just, it's not just this is true for every body horror film. That's not at all what I want to say. I do think there might be something worth looking at deeper when it comes to this kind of transformation and invasion idea, and maybe also look at feature films, because there is of course a difference between short films and feature films. Because in a short film you can make a film that is not resolved and doesn't have any causality, and you can have one that is very explained through and through. And with a 90-minute film, it's getting harder to not explain anything. So of course in a feature film there will be more reasoning and more logic. Otherwise it would be very experimental. But yeah, maybe I overstated the conclusion. It was just that I'm very excited that I could say like this thing is happening with these films as well. But the point that I also really want to stress again is that I started with the interest in these images and the composition of these images and how bodies are multiplied. And that is a deconstruction that's happening despite any kind of tendencies that are also incidentally there. Yeah.
I guess with like gender studies and gender critique, there's obviously the separation of gender as a social construction from biological sex. And obviously biology and body horror refers to the physicality of within the body, within the sexes. Do you find it that body horror is always very limiting to reinforcing the binary of two biological sexes? And is there an example of that deconstructs both gender and biology beyond the binary within body horror?
I do think that just looking at the images, this is what's happening. That's what I want to say, is that when we look at these kind of broken up silhouettes and the reflections and the multiplicities, this is already doing something to kind of break up this notion of the singularity of the body. But of course, this is like it's on a very kind of deep, subtle, weird layer. It's hard to imagine something that really breaks up everything, because like we have actors that kind of give their bodies to these films. So it's definitely going to be easier breaking this up in like animation films, because you can do anything, I think. But I think these are like subtleties within these films, like the splitting, the multiplying, the distorting, that kind of cause this effect of just unsettling something, and from this unsettling something else might happen. Like it might not.
Yeah, this is maybe related to the previous question, and I have to phrase it because my knowledge on hypothetical I want to talk about is very limited. But just imagine we had like in particular like the first film, and not with like cis bodies, but with trans bodies, with similar visuals. Would you say that your conclusion would apply in the same way, or would you draw the same conclusion, or do you think that like differentiating if you have a cis body or a trans body undergoing these transformations would be different? I don't know, because there is a different internal fear that would be projected in the trans body.
I think the whole process of relating the visuality to the narrative would have to be different. And I didn't do the visual analysis within these stories, because yes, it would be different. It would have to be different, because we have to. I didn't say that because it was getting too theoretical. But the method of close reading that I did is drawing from like post-structuralist theories and like deconstructive feminist film reading. And what this basically does it's not easy to reproduce findings, because all of these readings that I did for my master's thesis and now for these focus like on one film. Like I look at one film and I see what arises from there. So then of course the results are different.
Yeah, I can ask you after. I was going to ask, I'm a big fan of Carol Clover and Barbara Creed, and I was wondering if you had any other recommendations for other like theorists or I could check out.
Yeah, I have some references here. But these are not so useful, I think. If you like, these are very general. It's like short film, gender, everything. Okay, so much interest. Yeah, what can I recommend? These are not so detailed.
Okay. But it seems like a good, at least maybe introduction.
I think there's just off my mind there's a really huge kind of strand of kind of Deleuzian affect theory approaches to horror film and body horror broadly. And there's Anna Powell.
Anna Powell.
Yeah, and she wrote about the Lewis and horror film, but she has nice readings, I think.
What was the name again?
Anna Powell. And I think there's the other two I will tell you later.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else? Thank you so much.